has agreed to provide weapons to Ukraine. If Chancellor were to change his opinion, what would your stance be then? And what do you think the future of Germany is going to be? Have you made any threats or any warnings to Chancellor when he made the decision to provide weapons to Ukraine? Well, we never threaten anyone.
We never threaten anyone, especially the head of another state. It's bad taste. We have our position, our stance in various matters. We are aware of the stance of the European nations, of the Republic of Germany, in regards to the events in Ukraine, among other things. Everyone believes that Russia started the war in Ukraine, but no one, and I would like to emphasize this, no one in Europe wants to remember how this tragedy started. It started with the coup d'etat in Ukraine, anti-constitutional coup d'etat. That was the beginning of the war. Is Russia to blame in this coup d'etat? No. Have we forgotten those who are trying to put the blame on Russia, that foreign ministers of Poland, Germany and France traveled to Kiev and left their signatures on the document to settle the internal political crisis, standing as guarantors of the fact that crisis to be resolved by peaceful, constitutional way. But in Europe, including in Germany, they prefer not to remember this. And if they do, then it begs the question, why the leadership of Germany, among one of the guarantor countries, did not demand from those people who staged coup d'etat in Ukraine to go back to the legal, constitutional ways? Why did they forget about their responsibilities as guarantor country? So they are to blame for what's happening, along with other forces in the United States that provoked this unconstitutional coup. Don't we know what followed? The people of Crimea made a decision, voted for leaving Ukraine. Then there was the decision of the people of Donbass against being ruled by those people who staged this coup d'etat. That was when the conflict began. Then Russia made every effort to find a settlement formula, to find a peaceful solution. In 2015, in Minsk, the so-called Minsk Accords were signed. That were, by the way, recognized by the United Nations Security Council. And these were the documents that were to be enacted. But then they decided to resolve this matter via armed approach. They started using artillery, tanks, aviation against civilians in the east of Ukraine. Somehow, neither in Germany nor in other European countries or the United States, no one wants to remember this. No one wants to think about this. Fine, you facilitated the Minsk Accords. But then it turned out that no one planned to execute it, to carry it out. The former Chancellor of Germany and the former President of France publicly said that. How can we understand that? How are we to understand that? Because they publicly stated that they were not going to implement the Minsk Accords. They only signed it to arm Ukraine, to supply arms to Ukraine, and to go on with the hostilities. We were deceived. How else can we explain what happened back then? For 80 years, we had been trying to implement these decisions for 80 years. Some time ago, the former Chancellor told me that, okay, in Kosovo, NATO acted without the Security Council resolution, but so much blood was shed in Kosovo. But what about here, when Russian blood was shed in Donbass? Wasn't that blood? Was that water? No one wanted to think about that. No one wanted to notice that. And eventually, we had to, when then authorities in Ukraine claimed that they did not like a single item on the Minsk Accords, and then they said that they are not going to implement them. These territories, they started degrading from the social point of view, from economic point of view, for all these 8 years. What else we had to do? We had to recognize their independence. For almost 8 years, we hadn't recognized their independence because we were expecting a peaceful resolution to this issue for long 8 years. And when it was announced that no one is going to implement this agreement, we had to make an attempt to force them to do that. But we weren't the ones who started this war. The war started in 2013 after the coup d'etat, after the attempts to silence those who did not agree with this coup d'etat using cannons. And now, the people who are following the international events, international law, what happened next? We had not recognized them for 8 years, and when we understood that the Minsk Accords were not to be implemented, what did we do? We recognized independence of these self-proclaimed republics. Did we have the right to do that from the standpoint of international law? Article 1 of UN Charter stipulates that we could, because there is a right of self-determination for every nation, and UN's International Court ruled, it's also there on paper, that all the matters about independence, if any territory, if any country makes such a decision, it does not have to go to the courts of the state it was part of. It all was done in Kosovo. There is already a ruling by the UN International Court that says exactly that. If a territory makes a decision about independence, it does not have to approach the capital to receive a green light to carry out this right. If that's how it is, if the UN court says that, then those republics that were not recognized back then, Donetsk Republic and Lugansk Republic, they have the right to do that. They did that. Did we have the right to recognize these republics then? Of course we did. So we recognized them. Then we signed an agreement with them. Did we have the right to sign an agreement with them? Of course we did. And that agreement stipulated assisting these states in case of aggression. And Kiev unleashed the war against these states that we recognized after 8 years. So we have the right to recognize them, and then in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, we assisted them. So no matter what anyone here says, and I said the same thing, this logic, step by step. So we're there. Where's the violation of international law? There is no violation. We speak about international law. Yes, then we heard the response, still you were the ones to attack. We did not attack. We were on the defensive, to make it clear for everyone. And the first step to the war was made by those who provoked the anti-constitutional bloody coup d'etat. Now, as for the arms supplies to a conflict zone is always a bad thing. Even more so if it has anything to do with the fact that those who supply weapons, they do not only supply these weapons, they also control these weapons, which is a very serious, a very grave matter. And we know that Germany does not deny it. I don't know how it leaked into the media when a Bundeswehr generals, they were discussing how and when they should strike the Crimean Bridge or some other sites and facilities in Russia, including the territory that is recognized as being part of Russia, beyond any doubt. And when first German tanks were shipped to Ukraine, that came as a shock, an ethic shock in Russia, because we have always had very good attitude towards Germany in the Russian society. And now they are saying that there are going to be some missiles that will strike the territory of Russia. It is destroying Russian-German relations. It is destructive for these relations. But we understand that, as one of the famous German politicians claimed after World War II, the Federal Republic of Germany has never been a sovereign state. We remained in contact with Mr. Scholz. We met on many occasions. I do not want to give any assessment to the work the federal government is doing. It is up to the German people, to the German voters soon. There's going to be parliamentary elections in Europe. We'll see what happens then. From what I know, of course, I'm quite biased when we speak about Germany. There are a lot of people that I'm trying to not contact them to keep them safe, but I know that they are friends, reliable friends, and I have many such people in Germany. So from what I know about the political situation in Germany, I think there is some 16% is for the Social Democrats, 15% for Alternative for Germany, and then the rest of them is also going down. This is the response of the voters. That's the mood in the German society. I know that Germany is dependent in the matters of security, in the matters of safety and defense, in policies, in information policies, because no matter what media you look at, you will see that those who benefit from whatever information is published there is sitting across the ocean. I can only applaud to all those American foundations that are doing that. So good for them to hold so firmly the information policies in Europe, and they are trying to do it from behind the curtains. And it's really hard to resist all this. But still, there are some elementary things, and it's odd that no one in today's German leadership is even trying to protect German interests. Yes, Germany is not fully sovereign, but still there are Germans, and one has to think about their interests. So, okay, these pipelines were blown up on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, and no one basically cares, as if nothing happened, nothing special happened. Nevertheless, we continue to supply gas to Europe via the territory of Ukraine, because we are still doing that. There used to be 2 pipeline systems. One of them was shut down by the Ukrainian side. They just shut it down, even though they had no grounds for this. So there is only 1 pipeline now. But still, we are supplying gas to Europe by this pipeline. European consumers are receiving this gas. There is a third stream by Turkey. Our gas is supplied to Europe by the third stream. European consumers are receiving this gas. Okay, 1 pipeline, Nord Stream pipeline, was blown up. But there is a second Nord Stream pipe. Why doesn't Germany want to receive our gas by this pipe? It makes no sense. You can receive it via Ukraine, you can receive it via Turkey, but you cannot receive it by the Baltic Sea. It makes no sense. There is no logic behind this. Okay, you might say that Europe is not to receive any gas from Russia. Okay, we will survive this. But you do not need this. You need to pay 3 times more for the liquefied natural gas that you receive from across the ocean. And your environmentalists, don't they know how this liquefied natural gas is produced? As people in the United States, residents of the areas where this gas is produced, sometimes instead of tap water, they have some mud going from their taps. Your environmentalists from your government, don't they know this? They are well aware of this. In Poland, they shut down the Yamal-Europe pipeline. We used to supply gas via Poland. We weren't the ones to shut it down. Poland did. And impact on the German economy, stopping all these relations in energy. You are better aware of this outcome than me. It's a sad outcome. A lot of enterprises, they are looking elsewhere to work, but they do not want to work in Germany. They establish their facility in Asia, in the US, because economic conditions are such that they are not competitive. And it can have great consequences for the German economy, because everyone is well aware that the German economy, I'm not trying to insult anyone, is a driver for the European economy. If it faces problem, then the whole of Europe will face problem, because the French economy was also balancing on the edge of recession. Everyone is aware of that. If the German economy does the same, then the entire Europe will be shaken. I'm not asking you to violate some kind of European Atlantic ties or treaties. Someone might hear this and then they will say, so he wants to drive a wedge to break the Euro-democratic solidarity. I think that your policies are mistaken. It was a great mistake what you did. And for the United States, what's happening now, it's also a bad thing. It was a mistake what they did, a capital mistake. Out of this desire to keep their leadership, they are harming themselves, damaging themselves. But it's even worse for Europe. You might have said that we support you here and here, but look, if we undermine our economy, then everyone will suffer. We must not do this. We are against this. Don't go there. Don't do that. But the German government of today, they are not even doing this. To be frank, sometimes I do not understand the logic behind this behavior. Okay, you wanted to undermine the Russian economy. And you believe that it was going to happen in 4 or 6 months, but then everyone saw that that was not happening. Our economy grew 3.4%, I believe. First quarter of this year, the Russian economy grew 5.4%. And the World Bank made some calculations because we set a goal for ourselves. According to the data of various international finance organizations, we were ranking 5 in the purchasing power parity, ranking 5 in the world, and we set a goal to become a number 4 country. At this indicator, I think you saw what some people from the financial institutions claim. The World Bank calculated our GDP, and they concluded that we are ahead of Japan. According to World Bank, Russia is the fourth economy of the world in purchasing power parity. So we have reached this goal. But that's not what's important. It's important to keep up the pace, of moving forward. And we are doing this because we have increased the GDP by 5.4%. And I'm not just bragging. I'm not saying this to brag. But those who are trying to damage us, to hinder our development, they must understand that what they are doing is more damaging to them than to us. And when they understand this, they must draw some conclusions and adjust their behavior for their own benefit. But that's not what's happening. I do not want to insult, to offend anyone. But the level of the professional training of those people who are making decisions in Germany, in my opinion, leaves much to be desired.
I think it would make sense not to move away from the European topics and to give the floor to France, where quite officially they're not ruling out sending of military to Ukraine. And we have Karim Talbi, editor-in-chief for Europe, and he speaks Russian very well because just like Martin Romanchik, he worked as a correspondent in Moscow. Mr. Talbi, you have the floor. My question also regards Ukraine. Why still you cannot tell us the loss of Russian military servicemen in the Ukrainian during the conflict? If it's the only thing that is of interest to you.
If you're interested, I can tell you that no one discloses such figures ever. And if they do, they distort the actual figures. And I can tell you with confidence that our losses, especially if we are talking about the irreversible losses, they are much less than in Ukraine by multiple times. And as to the prisoners of war, we have 1,348 people kept in Ukraine. I know this because we're working with Ukrainian every day, and so if we're speaking about Ukrainian soldiers held in Russia, there are 6,465, I believe. So if we're talking about this kind of losses, so it's about 1 to 5. That's the ratio we're talking about. And this is something that we will proceed from. And this is also why there is an attempt to enact a total mobilization regime in Ukraine, because they lose a lot of people on the battlefield. So, according to our estimates, the Ukrainian army loses about 50,000 people every month. So this is both non-recoverable losses and the medical losses, and there's about 50 to 50 a relation between these two kinds of losses. And the current decisions that they're making, they're not solving the situation, because we have information from various sources. They're able to mobilize about 30,000 people per month, and they're making people go to the front lines. There are no volunteers, not very many volunteers. And so last month they had more, but it doesn't solve the problem, because the mobilization effort is only enough to cover the losses. All of the people they are able to mobilize go to recoup the personnel they have lost. So that's a fundamental problem that is leading them to lower the age of mobilization. Now they have 25 years of age, and we know that it's an open secret in Ukraine that the United States administration is insisting that the age is lowered stepwise from 25 to 23, and then through some steps to 18 years, or maybe directly to 18 years of age. Now they're requiring people who are 17 to register in the military conscription office. So we know that this is a requirement put by the United States administration to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian leadership, if we can call it that, after the elections were cancelled. I think I've said it publicly recently when I met the press after my visit to Dagestan. I think the United States administration will force the current Ukrainian leadership to make the decisions to lower the mobilization age to 18, and then they will get rid of Zelensky. They need him to make this unpopular decision. They need someone to pass the law, to make some formal steps. So now we're in June 2024, and in order to do that, I think they will need about a year. So they will tolerate him until next spring, or something like that. And after he's done that, they will say bye-bye. I think they have several candidates to replace him. But certainly the losses are great. 50,000 is only what we're seeing being lost in the battlefield. That's the most conservative estimate. But there are also losses that we know that exist, but we cannot calculate them. So the actual figure is much higher. So that's what I have to say about losses.
Can I allow me to ask yet another question about our Olympic Games? We used to have a journalist, Arman Surdin, on the 9th of May 2003, died in Ukraine. We think that he died after the drone strike, as we think. France is conducting an investigation. And they're saying that the drone that killed him came from Russia. Well, that's not my question, but the Ministry of Justice of France would like to conduct an investigation. Would like to conduct an investigation. Okay. Is Russia prepared to cooperate with France? So you would know what truly happened. It was a major tragedy for us, for our agency, because, he was survived by family. He was 32. Roman Selin was 32 years old. So we would like to have some closure, some kind of serious investigative work done to know what happened. Would Russia take part in that? We've
never turned down any proposals to carry out investigation. You know how many journalists we have who died in the war zone?
Do you remember, Dmitry?
At least 30 people. So at least 30 people died among our journalists. And no one is giving us an opportunity to investigate and to learn what happened to them. And next, if we talk about what's happened in Ukraine, they tortured an American journalist to death in Ukrainian prison. But unlike you, the United States are not even putting the question of what happened to him. And he's an American citizen, an American journalist. He was captured on the Ukrainian border, he was put into prison, and then he died. They tortured him to death, quite literally. But no one went to the trouble of asking what actually happened. So, despite all of that, we are willing to organize this work. I'm not sure of how we can arrange this in practice, because if a person has died in the war zone, well, it's difficult, but we will do everything we can.
Mr. Talbi, and I'd like to give the floor to our Iranian colleague, Director General on the Information Energy Agency, IRNA, Mr. Ali Nadri. We appreciate that, Mr. Nadri, that despite the recent tragedy and death of President Raisi and the continued election campaign in your country, still found time to travel out to St. Petersburg. Please allow me to express to you, to the Iranian colleagues and Iranian nation, our deepest condolences. Please, you have the floor.
ممنون هستم از دعوت.
Indeed, we're mourning the death of our foreign minister and the president, a number of people for administration. And you, in your letter, mentioned, indeed, there was a development of relations during the time of President Raisi. That is one of the great services of our president. You also pointed out the role played by President Raisi in the development of bilateral relations and the regional relations. And the question that I wanted to ask you is that there will be continued development of relations with Iran. What kind of program is planned? Were there some agreements achieved with President Raisi? What is the outlook for Iran and Russia in the future? Thank you.
Relations between Iran and Russia are developing pretty well in many areas. Both Russia and Iran are under numerous sanction regimes, which came as a surprise to me when we familiarized ourselves with some industries in Iran. We were surprised by how our Iranian friends, under these conditions, under all these sanctions, they managed to preserve such a great growth in a lot of areas, not everywhere, but still, it's a fact. And we have planned a program of joint efforts. We are developing trade and economic ties, and we would like to make additional efforts to develop cooperation in advanced technology area. Considering all these restrictions, it's a difficult thing to do, but still, it is feasible, it is doable. As for deceased President Raisi, who died in that crash, I would like to say that we had very good, reliable, business-like relations. He was a very interesting person, a serious politician, reliable partner. In everyday life, he had a good sense of humor. He was pretty sense of irony. It was very interesting to maintain relations, contact with him. And it was useful as well, because once again, if we reached any agreement, we could be certain that the topic that we discussed will not be forgotten, that everything will be resolved the way we agreed. Because not only on the head of state depends whether an issue is resolved, but both of us, we worked together to try to improve our relations even further. And under Raisi, Iran has become a SCO member and a BRICS member, which shows that together we were moving in this clear direction. We were trying to establish a multipolar world, and Iran has played and continues to play a vital role, an essential role in all of this. And the only thing that I would like to add, concluding my answer to your question, is that we really hope that everything that was done by President Raisi for the Russian-Iranian relations, it will be continued. And I don't have the doubt in this regard, because everything we do in mutual interest, and we can see this from the strengthening Iranian statehood. We know how the supreme power works in Iran. We know that it's not only the president who is in charge of developing relations in particular with Russia, but a lot is done by the supreme leader, spiritual leader of the country. And now we expect these elections to be held, and hopefully I'll have a chance to meet a new Iranian president in various international events of the SCO, of BRICS. I'm certain that we will find common language, common ground, and we will implement all the projects that we have agreed upon with the former president of Iran.
The late President Raisi. The next speaker is a great friend of TASS agencies, editor-in-chief of Xinhua Agency, Mr. Liu Yansong. He speaks perfect Russian. He loves Russian songs and Russian cinema. Over to you, please. Mr. President, recently you have conducted a state visit to China. You have quite close relations with China. This can be cited as a model for building relations between major powers. What's your take on the current state of cooperation between Russia and China?
As to our bilateral relations, I want to note that they are not situation-based. They are based on deep mutual interests. Over 15 years, China is our main trade and economic partner. We've started building up our relations, and we reached the level that they are at today, not by following the current political agenda, but it is a result of a long development based on mutual interests. We acted in a very calm and stepwise manner, and I'll be careful in my assessment, but I say that we're doing quite well. Our mutual trade is exceeding our expectation. The Chinese say we have $240 billion. Our assessment is slightly lower, about $230 billion. But it's not about the volume of trade, but about the fact that we're diversifying it quite successfully. And not only in hydrocarbons and energy, we're supplying oil, gas, oil, and electricity to China. We're building nuclear power plants in China, and it's all quite successful. But we also have good prospects in high-tech sectors such as aircraft, engineering, and artificial intelligence, and we're very happy for China seeing its successes in many areas, such as space exploration. China has shown unique achievements, and the Chinese Communist Party is the leading political power in China, and so everything that is done in China is led by the party. And one thing I'd like to note, I think I've already mentioned this somewhere, but I'm not sure that it wasn't such a company as today. I think it would be interesting to mention we have experts and economists, young and talented and experienced people. They say that analyzing what's happening in the Chinese economy and in some other leading economies such as the United States shows that the Chinese have managed to create a very peculiar but effective model of economic development that is more effective than the model in the United States. And judging by the results from the Chinese economy, this seems to be true. Of course, we can argue a lot with the Chinese leadership, and our Western colleagues argue, saying that some of the aspects are not very market-like, that the Politburo is setting restrictions, but we know what the ultimate outcome is. We're seeing evidence that this model is more effective. So, who can blame China? be it market or not market, you have 1.5 billion people. The Chinese leadership must take care of all of those. Not all of those 1.5 billion live like an average European or American. So the Chinese leadership has all the right to do what it must to fulfill the basic needs of its people. And the Chinese leadership, headed by the president and my good friend, as we often say, it's what they're doing. And it's what they're doing in a very reliable way, in a very robust fashion. So we can only be happy seeing this. We know what's happening in the leading economies. We know what's happening in the Chinese economy. It's becoming more and more high-tech. And I think it is a big mistake on the part of the United States or some European countries to try to slow down the Chinese economy. I think that if you want to be successful yourself, you must adapt to these processes and not try to hamper them. So, what are the smart people saying? They're saying that the Chinese have an overproduction of cars. But who is saying that? It is being said by people who think they are all for the market. But don't they know who decides whether there is overproduction or not? It is decided by the market. So if China has produced a certain number of cars and the market absorbs that volume, what overproduction are we talking about? It's just nonsense. Can you say that they have overproduced? No, it's a different thing. They're just trying to limit growth using non-market means, and that's a harmful thing to do, including for the American economy in this case. Because if they don't buy these and these goods from China, what will they have? They will either have to produce it themselves or buy elsewhere, and this will be more expensive. This means that the inflation in the United States will grow, and inflation will have a negative impact on the entire economic structure of the country who is using this practice. And that is harmful. In this case, we're seeing it harm the American economy. So it's another mistake that they're making, another mistake of the current US administration. As to China, we're seeing a very skillful and professional leadership on the part of President Xi Jinping. The country is developing steadily and at the rate needed by the country. And as to other areas and sectors, I've already said that multiple times, and I can only reiterate that it's playing the role of ensuring stability. And ensuring mutual security is very important. And we are carrying out joint exercises, and we will do it in the future as well, including joint military exercises. We have military technical cooperation projects. We have things we can offer to our Chinese friends, and our Chinese friends are interested to work with us. But our cooperation is not limited by the economy or military and technical cooperation, or even interaction in the international arena. This year, we have mutual years of culture. There are these Russian songs, and you can hear Russian language. And I think it is as important as everything else I've mentioned, because it creates a foundation for the peoples to interact. It creates a good environment for developing relations in other sectors. So this is what I think both parties will pursue, and I hope that I will be able to meet the President of China soon at the SCO and BRICS to discuss all that.
SCO and BRICS.
And that is after now.
Thank you. Now moving on to the next participant. Deputy Head of ANSA Agency, Stefano Poli. Mr. Poli, just like Sami Yanakou from Reuters, has tremendous experience of working in hotspots, and in general, NANSA, Italian agency, never missed a meeting with you, and they're our permanent guests. Mr. Poli, you have the floor. Thank you. Good evening, Mr. President. Thank you for organizing this meeting. I'd like to ask you a question about the latest events in Ukraine. Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Stoltenberg, suggested that Ukraine be given an opportunity to strike the Russian territory using the weapons procured from Europe. Some European countries agreed with this notion, including the United States. Not all of them, but the United States are also close to it. Still, some countries are holding discussions about sending military instructors and counselors. I'd like to ask you to comment on these two decisions. What will be Russian response to that? Thank you.
From the point of view of advisors and instructors, that's nothing new. They are present in Ukraine, and fortunately for them, They are suffering casualties, I know it for a fact. So we're not doing that intentionally. It just so happens in a war zone, but in the West, in the United States, they are trying to conceal this fact. Secondly, as for high-precision, long-range weapons, here we need to divide this topic into two parts. First is conventional, conventional weapons, the rocket fire systems, 70 kilometers, with the range of 70 kilometers or something like that. So they were employed since long, and the Ukrainian troops can do it on their own. As for the high-tech, modern, long-range, high-precision weapons, such as Storm Shadows from Britain, or ATACMS from the United States, or the French missiles, what can I say in this regard? I have already spoken about this when I was departing Uzbekistan. I was answering a similar question. So, how do they use it? For example, they supply a missile system. The Pentagon, Americans supplied this system. How do they use it? How do they employ it? Ukrainian troops, they cannot do the entire job on their own and to use this missile. From technological point of view, they are not capable of that. For this, they need satellite reconnaissance. Then, based on this satellite reconnaissance, which is the American satellites, they need to create a task for this missile to set a goal, and then they need to enter it into this missile system, this target that they've chosen. And a trooper who's there next to this system, he does it automatically. He doesn't even have to know what happens next. What can Ukrainian troops do? Not those who are pushing these buttons, pressing these buttons, but higher level Ukrainian troops. They can choose the targets. They can say what target is a priority for them, what they need, what they require, but they are not making a decision whether to strike this target or not. Because, again, I repeat, the target is entered into the system by those who have supplied this weapon. If it's American supplied weapon, then it's done by the Pentagon. If it's a Storm Shadow, then it's done by the Brits. And with the Storm Shadow, it's even simpler. And it's simpler because the target is set automatically without the troops on the ground. And it means the Brits are the ones who are doing that. That's the extent of it. And when Bundeswehr officers were considering whether to strike the Crimean Bridge or other sites, they were discussing this decision, making this decision by themselves. No one did that for them. The same is true for the French specialists. The Western specialists are doing that. So we have no illusions to this regard, in this regard. So what should we do in response? First, we are going to improve our air defense systems. We are going to destroy these missiles. Secondly, we are thinking about if someone deems possible to supply such weapons to the war zone, to strike our territory, to create more problems for us, why won't we supply similar weapons to those regions of the world where they will be used against sensitive sites of those countries that are making it against Russia? So we can respond asymmetrically, and we will give it a thought. And thirdly, of course, such actions will completely, it has already reached the high level of degradation, but these actions will destroy international relations, will undermine international security, and eventually, if we see that these countries are joining the war against us, and this is the direct participation in the hostilities and the war against the Russian Federation, then we believe it is our right to respond in kind. So it is a path to very serious problems. So that's it. If you have any follow-up questions, please, but I don't think I would be able to add anything.
Any other questions, Mr. Pauly? Or you've heard everything you wanted? I have yet another question, but I don't know whether it's the right moment to ask it. There won't be any other moment. We'll just leave now,
we'll leave
so
soon,
you should
so
ask.
that's the perfect moment to ask your question.
I wanted to ask you a question about Italy, if I may. Italy supports Ukraine, politically and militarily. But it also makes statements that Italy is not in the state of war with Russia. If you could please comment on the position of the Italian leadership.
We see that the stance of the Italian government is more reserved than the policies of many other European countries. And we notice this, and we assess it as such. So we can see that there is no caveman Russophobia raging in Italy, and we also know this, we mark this. We really think that with Italy, maybe after the situation changes in Ukraine somewhat, we will establish relations with Italy, and maybe even faster than
with any other European country. Thank you, Mr. Poli. Next, we have Korea Digital Development Executive Director, Mr. Park Son-hoon. You have the floor, sir. Russia is cooperating with North Korea in development of the Far East, and in a great fashion. When the South Korean ambassador provided you with his credentials, you said that there could be development of relations. What is the outlook for that?
Well, just as with relation to Italy, I can say that we see that the Korean leadership does not exhibit a Russophobic slant, and there are no direct supplies of weapons to the conflict zone, and we appreciate that highly. But we also see that American companies are making approaches to buy weapons to redirect them to Ukraine, and we're also watching that closely. And we count on Russian-Korean relationships not to deteriorate, and that there will be a mutual interest in developing our relations, and we're interested in developing our relations with the Korean Peninsula as a whole. And what's happening is having a negative impact on the trade and economic ties, sadly. But we expect that the momentum reached in the previous decades in our relations will be preserved, at least partly, so that we're able to restore them in the future. But today, sadly, in many areas of our cooperation, we're seeing Korea create very serious problems, and it is lamentable. We're now working with other countries, even though we would have preferred to work with the Republic of Korea. But it is not our choice. It is a choice made by the Republic of Korea, but we are open to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Park, for your question. Mr. Putin, if you would allow me, I'd like the question on behalf of TASS News Agency. Yes, please go ahead. I would like us to go back to the Russian economy. This is just like, as people say, please keep talking about it. You spoke about the current state of economy, but there were, if you remember, there were people who said that the Russian economy is in tatters, and then they were sanctioned multiple times, hundreds of sanctions. Now it's 3 years of the special military operation. What's the future outlook for Russian economy? Is it just as wonderful as the current state? What do you think?
Some of our ill-wishers think that these sanctions, which now number about 16 or 17,000, I don't think there's any other country in the world which faced such a great number of sanctions, but these sanctions are certainly a hindrance, and these ill-wishers of ours, they think that in the middle term it will reflect negatively on us. And this assumption has some grounds. Those who think this way have a way to justify it, especially in terms of high technology and some other modern areas of expertise such as artificial intelligence, microelectronics. Everyone knows what the problems are. But there are two buts here. First, even in the best times of our relations with the so-called collective West, there never was a time when there were no restrictions. Restrictions always existed, and I have every reason to believe that we shouldn't have expected close cooperation in such sensitive areas as high tech. Problems are being created, and we see those problems. But however surprising it might be, even for ourselves, we overcome those problems. The things we used to buy in large amounts, when we saw that we cannot buy them any longer, we see that we have to turn our brains on. We have to talk to our manufacturers, to our developers who do these things. And they don't just occupy the niches vacated by Western manufacturers. They take their business up and they develop it further in a very quick fashion. So I think that it is surprising not only for our ill wishes, but for ourselves as well. I'll take the most primitive example. I won't name the sector, but there was a manufacturer who used to buy a vessel, a container, just a simple element, but that used some complex alloys. So the supplies of this element ceased. I said, what did you do? And they said, well, we ordered it in Nizhny Novgorod. And the people in Nizhny Novgorod managed to produce it at 1/3 of the price and with similar quality. And we have similar examples. We have similar cases in many other areas. And this is the source of the growth, 3.4% of the GDP. And this growth will certainly have its limits. The niche is occupied by Russian manufacturers, and the next steps to be made to develop these industries vacated by Western companies. This is producing growth, but this growth has its limit, and we are aware of that. And this is why we are setting goals, strategic goals, and one of them is achieving technological independence. We intend to invest into achieving this goal in order to catch up where we have to catch up still, and to move forward to advance to the next stages of industrial development. So we understand what the goal is, and whether we will succeed. Of course, I cannot see the future, but I'm optimistic, especially if we have to do it, if we are forced to do it. And so it's not about the government, it's about those who are part of the economy. The companies can always go back to Western producers if they offer acceptable prices for good quality, but if that does not happen, we will have to do it ourselves. Yes, of course, on some of the items, we will have to move them to the right and to put some things off. But we're now making a plane, MS-21, and it includes a very modern wing with flexible elements made from American materials, and they're now sanctioned. They state that they are of dual purpose, but that is of course nonsense. The actual reason is that it's a competitor to a Boeing plane of a similar class. And so our production came to a halt, and we had to work on it, and we had to put in additional 2 years of work, but we've succeeded. Now the plane is flying successfully. So I have no doubts that we'll be able to do it, but it's only a question of time frames. Of course, if we have to spend the time catching up and someone is moving forward at that time, and so we will try to move it at an advanced rate and try to become a step ahead. So there are no critical barriers, and I hope that there will be
that's going to be the case going forward. And it's only logical to give the floor to a representative of the country that's leading in terms of slapping sanctions. There are 3,500 sanctions. We have News Director for Europe and Africa at the Associated Press, James Jordan. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President Putin, for this opportunity to address you directly. Over 2 years ago, you sent Russian troops into Ukraine, as you say, to protect Russians and Russian speakers in the Donbass region and to keep NATO from your country's eastern border. Since then, thousands have died on both sides, and the fighting has even come to some regions of Russia. In the last few hours, it's been confirmed to the Associated Press by a Western official that Ukraine has used US weapons on Russian soil in the last few days. Do you see this as a further provocation, to follow on from my colleague from ANSA's question? Could you sum up for us what you feel Moscow has achieved in the last 2 years, and how does the fighting stop?
The first thing that we did, we carried out. The first thing we did, we put our obligation to the people who suffered from the coup d'etat, and the hostilities in the southeastern Ukraine that followed this coup d'etat. We recognized the rights of these people residing in these territories to protect their interests, their lives, the lives of their children. In my opinion, this is the main thing. And we've also demonstrated to ourselves and to the entire world that we do not just talk about protecting the interests, but we are doing this and we will do this without any doubts, and everyone will have to reckon with this. As for the second part of your question, what has to be done to stop the hostilities in Ukraine, I can tell you the thing that I told Mr. Biden. He sent me a letter and I responded to him. in writing, if you want to stop the hostilities in Ukraine, stop supplying the weapons, then in 2-3 months, everything will be over. This is it. That's one. Two, we call upon everyone to stop hampering the possible peace process. And I have to remind about what's happening, what has happened in late 2022. We agreed with Ukraine. We agreed to sign an agreement with them that would have given answers to a number of key matters. The first essential matter for Ukraine is ensuring security of Ukraine. And in the draft agreement, it was stipulated in such a way that Ukraine is not going to be a NATO member. It is going to remain a neutral country. But the ensuring of security was described in such a way that it was very close to the NATO Charter, to the Articles 4 and 5 of the NATO Charter. I guess I do not have to delve into details, but it meant that all the signatories, in case of necessity, were supposed to help Ukraine, to assist Ukraine with armed military assistance. It was a difficult matter for us, I said. We needed time to think it over, but it was something to be discussed. The same went for the interests of Russia. Once again, I repeat that. Neutral status of Ukraine. And this is what the Russian Federation is interested in. Other than that, if you remember, we spoke about denazification of Ukraine. And I was very surprised when they started asking me what denazification was. It means banning, prohibiting with laws, propagating Nazism. As odd as it might seem, we found common ground in this regard, as well as in a number of other key issues that were needed to be resolved to settle this entire conflict. And if the head of the negotiating team from Ukraine signed the document, initialed the document, I think it serves as an evidence that overall it was a satisfactory document for Ukraine. And if we did sign it as well, it means that Russia was also satisfied with that. I do not want to put you in a difficult situation, but I will ask you a rhetoric question. Why Mr. Johnson traveled to Kiev and recommended to throw this agreement to the rubbish bin? Why did he set this goal for his Kievan counterparts to inflict a strategic defeat to Russia, to defeat Russia on the battlefield? Ukraine, its officials, publicly stated that if they signed that agreement, if they finalized that agreement, the war would have stopped in late 2022. We weren't the ones who said that. Ukrainian officials publicly stated that. So I've got a rhetoric question. Why someone needed to interfere to stop us and Ukraine to sign this agreement? I can only make a guess. Someone wanted to accomplish the goals that they had regarding Russia, to bring Russia to destruction. No matter what the cost, to inflict, to deal a strategic defeat to Russia. You asked me what needs to be done. Hopefully I gave you a full answer. And when you have the chance to speak to the leadership of your country, ask them, why did you stop? Why did you interfere in signing a peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine? What I told you are my guesses. Maybe there is some official response to this. But I cannot give you this answer instead of my counterparts from the US or the UK. And the fact that Mr. Johnson traveled there with the support of the US administration, I have no doubt to this regard.
With your permission, may I ask a very brief other question away from Ukraine regarding the American reporter Evan Gershkovich, who's been in custody for more than a year now. There's been no evidence made public about what crime he may have committed. Can you give us the latest on any talks that might be happening with the US as regards his release and when we might expect to see him?
You believe he did no wrong, and Russian law enforcement agencies and special services believe that his actions violated the law on espionage. I'm not going to delve into details now. I know that the US administration is making vigorous efforts to release him. But these matters are not settled via media. It requires quiet approach and a dialogue between special services, and these matters must be resolved based on reciprocal approach, and the relevant agencies of the two countries are in contact with each other.